This lesson will cover Chapter 9 on agriculture, and this is Key Issue 4, covering why farmers face sustainability challenges. This will be the first part of Key Issue 4, and the next video will be the second part. Key Issue 4 covers 7 topics. First, losing agricultural land. Second, improving agricultural productivity. Third, conserving agricultural resources. Fourth, applying biotech to agriculture. Fifth, global food trade. Sixth, the global agriculture and undernourishment. And lastly, sustainable agriculture. This video will cover the first 4 parts. Take a look at figure 9-39 located on page 332 of your textbook. In this graph, you will see that food production has kept up with population growth despite very little increase in agricultural land. Agricultural land is threatened by urbanization and desertification. Urbanization is the establishment of more cities, and desertification is when land is no longer arable or usable for agriculture. 2 centuries ago, many people believed that there would always be available land for people to cultivate. Today, very few scientists believe that further expansion of agriculture will be able to feed the growing world population. At first, new agricultural land may appear to be available because only 11% of the world's land area is being cultivated. But in recent decades, population has increased much more rapidly than agricultural land. That is what you can see graphed here. Let's look at figure 9-40 located on page 333 of your textbook. What you will see here is that considerable amounts of Maryland's prime farmland is being threatened by urbanization. This means that as cities expand, farmland is no longer available. Prime farmland is typically flat and well drained. Significant environmental features include water quality, flood control, species habitats, historic sites, and attractive scenery. This map shows that 4% of the state's farmland had prime soils, significant environmental features, and high projected population growth, and about 25% had 2 of the 3 factors. Maryland demonstrated urbanization being a big threat to agricultural land, and this map will indicate how desertification is a threat. The most severe problems are in northern Africa, Central Australia, and the southwestern parts of Africa, Asia, North America, and South America. Desertification, which is also semi-arid land degradation, happens because of excessive crop planting, animal grazing, and tree cutting. When this happens, it exhausts the soil's nutrients and it hurts agricultural use in the future. In addition, excessive water can threaten other agricultural areas too, especially drier lands that receive water from human-built irrigation systems. Agricultural production has increased faster than farmland. In the late 20th century, subsistence farming practices needed to provide enough food for a rapidly increasing population, as well as for the growing number of urban residents who could not grow their own food. Subsistence farmers increase the supply of food through intensification of production that they achieve in 2 ways. First, by implementing new farming methods, like using plows instead of axes and sticks, doing more weeding, using more manure, creating more terraces, and more irrigation. As a result, this kind of farming needs more labor, and it is expected to yield much more food per area of land. The second way that it's achieved is leaving land fallow for shorter periods of time. This means stressing the land much more heavily. The Green Revolution reached its height in the 1970s and 1980s, and it involves 2 main practices: the introduction of new higher yield seeds and the expanded use of fertilizers. Because of the Green Revolution, agricultural productivity at a global scale has increased faster than population growth. Another aspect that has contributed to agricultural production increasing faster than farmland is increased technology, particularly with commercial agriculture, more specifically with the use of GMOs. Take a look at figure 9-43 located on page 335 of your textbook. This picture is of the International Rice Research Institute, which is home of the Green Revolution. Miracle high-yield seeds have been produced through laboratory experiments at this institute. Here we see the testing of different rice varieties. Productivity has also increased among commercial farmers in recent years. New seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, mechanical equipment, and management practices have made it so commercial farmers are able to obtain greatly increased yields per area of land. Take a look at figure 9-44 located on page 335 of your textbook. As you can see, the amount of milk per cow has increased in the United States. The experience of dairy farming in the U.S. demonstrates the growth in productivity. The number of dairy cows in the U.S. decreased from 10.8 million to 9.3 million between 1980 and 2014. But milk production increased from 58 to 93 million metric tons. This means that yield per cow increased 78% during this 34-year period. Although this demonstrates higher productivity, many have been worried about how this has been achieved, as cows are injected with hormones to unnaturally produce this amount of yield. Now let's talk about agriculture and water in California. Take a look at figure 9-45 located on page 337 of your textbook. California's use of irrigation for agriculture is especially apparent after years of drought. California is a very important source of agriculture for the entire world, and its limited water supply comes from two main sources. First, surface water. That includes water from rivers, streams, and lakes. Second is groundwater, and this comes from wells or springs. The distribution of water in California does not match the distribution of demand. Most of California's water is in the north, where most of the demand is in the central and southern parts of the state. Urban areas use around 20% of the water that California distributes. Most of the demand actually comes from agriculture, making up about 80% of California's distributed water. Take a look at figure 9-47 located on page 338 of your textbook. A genetically modified organism, also known as a GMO, is a living organism that possesses a combination of genetic material obtained through the use of modern biotechnology. GMO seeds are genetically modified to survive when herbicides and insecticides are sprayed on fields to kill weeds and insects. Genetic modification is especially widespread in the United States. 94% of soybeans are genetically modified, 90% of cotton, and 88% of corn, also known as maize. 3/4 of the processed food that Americans consume has at least one genetically modified ingredient. Because the use of GMOs are a major part of industry in the United States, they have urged developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, to increase their food supply using GMOs. The positives of using GMOs include higher yields, increased nutrition, and more resistance to pests. They can also taste better and can be more visually appealing. Even though there are benefits, there are also detriments that are cited with opposition. These negatives include health problems. Consuming large quantities of genetically modified foods can reduce the effectiveness of antibiotics and could also destroy long-standing ecological balances in local agriculture. The next issue is with exporting problems. Africa does a lot of exporting to Europe, and because Europeans have very negative sentiments toward the use of GMOs, They may be inclined not to purchase the product or the produce coming out of African countries. The last reason cited by opposition is the increased dependence on the United States that GMOs might bring about. Africans fear that the biotech companies that make these GMO seeds would introduce terminator seeds, meaning that these seeds would prevent farmers from replanting them after harvest and require them to continue purchasing the seeds year after year from the corporations. Lastly, take a look at figure 9-48 located on page 339 of your textbook. Many countries require genetically modified organisms to be labeled, as in the European label shown in set. Surprisingly, North America is holding out from this transparency. Many would say this may be attributed to the North American Free Trade Agreement that exists between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And by chance, the United States has placed pressure on Mexico and Canada into not labeling their products that have and contain GMOs. You should be familiar with the arguments surrounding the use of GMOs. You can find these on page 339 of your textbook. Those that argue GMOs should be labeled say mandatory labeling of GMO products would give consumers the information necessary to choose whether or not to consume GMOs. They also believe that most countries other than the US have signed agreements to regulate GMOs, including labels. And lastly, the US consumers may wish to cut back on their consumption of GMOs until more is learned about their long-term effects on ecosystems and health. On the flip side, for those that argue that GMOs should not be labeled, they would argue labeling would unnecessarily spook consumers because labeling is for health and safety, not type of seed. GMOs have comparable nutrition content to GMO-free food as well. Also, mandatory labeling would severely disrupt US agriculture because GMO products are already widespread in the food system. And lastly, the private sector is increasingly labeling GMO-free products, so requiring GMO labeling is unnecessary. This is the end of the lesson on Chapter 9, Key Issue 4, Part 1. Please stay tuned for the last lesson on Part 2 of Key Issue 4.